This is John Siciliano from Penguin Classics. I'm here with Julia Lovell, the translator of The Real Story of AQ and Other Tales of China by Lu Xun, the father of modern Chinese literature. And we're talking about Chinese literature in the 20th century, and in particular, Lu Xun. Is there a Chinese Tolstoy or Dostoevsky? Is it Lu Xun?
I think that's an excellent question. It sort of builds on from your last question, which was why is Lu Xun called the father of Chinese literature, and so of modern Chinese literature. So on the one hand, he has this tremendous status because his critical impulses and the themes which he explored, and also his creation of these characters such as RQ and others who very quickly sort of really grabbed hold of the national imagination. But he also has had a sort of very clear technical linguistic contribution to make to the creation of a modern Chinese literature. What's important to bear in mind is that in the sort of the last decade of the 19th century and the first decade or two of the 20th century, this is a time when ideas about Chinese literature and culture are in tremendous flux. So very generally speaking, up to that point, the sort of the prestige language for Chinese literature was the classical language, so not the vernacular language, very terse and elusive and very sort of elitist classical language, which you needed to spend sort of years and sort of decades studying to truly master. And also the sort of the prestige genre of imperial China was poetry, followed by essays. So fiction, by contrast, was sort of very much a disreputable poor cousin. It was right at the bottom of the hierarchy of literary genres. But what's happening in sort of the first couple of decades of the 20th century? Broadly speaking, you can talk about the rise of Chinese nationalism, I suppose, a sort of desire among sort of educated elites to try and educate the Chinese people into a nation, and also to give them a culture which will draw the Chinese people in and also enable China to stand up on a global stage next to the vigorous cultures of the West, such as Britain and America and France and so on. And in literary terms, what this strongly means is the rise of a realist fiction. Realist is very consciously borrowed from 19th century French writers and sort of Russian writers, which Chinese writers of the time are very, very enthusiastic about. So on the one hand, the genres, the elite genres do change, but also the literary language changes. Again, in the interest of drawing readers into a national literature, and also in the interest of representing these ordinary people in literature. Someone like Lu Xun in particular is especially influential in investing the vernacular, which before was sort of rather disreputable popular idiom. So Lu Xun invests the vernacular with a sort of prestige. He turns it into a serious and sophisticated literary language. The sort of key turning point for that, I would say, is a short story like The Diary of a Madman, which is sort of very sort of serious and surreal, and also sort of pretty opaque and pretty difficult. I mean, Lu Xun's early readers were actually quite flummoxed by this story. It took a few years to catch up with Lu Xun's own meaning for it. So that, I suppose that's why I suggested at the beginning that sort of Lu Xun is both Dickens and Joyce rolled into one. You know, he's this socio-political chronicler of China, but also he's a remaker of language and form.
You're listening to Penguin Classics on air.
This program is brought to you by Penguin Books, the publisher of the 2010 Pulitzer Prize-winning Lords of Finance. Liaquat Ahmed's Lords of Finance is a potent reminder of the enormous impact that the decisions of central bankers can have, their fallibility, and the terrible human consequences that can result when they're wrong. Lords of Finance, available now from Penguin Books.
You're listening to Penguin Classics on air.
This impulse toward realist language and toward a kind of, I hesitate to say democratizing language. How would that dovetail with the rule of Mao Zedong? He embraced Lu Xun eventually. Did he always admire Lu Xun?
Lu Xun's very, very curious, iconic afterlife. Lu Xun died young in his 50s in 1936. Like many patriotic, concerned Chinese writers in the 1920s, he started to look leftwards. By around about 1930, he sort of had embraced the ideals and values of the young Chinese communist movement. But those roughly 6 years before his death, in which he was supposedly an advocate of communist literature and art, was very, very troubled ones for Lu Xun. He died in 1936, still rowing, sort of in the middle of a sort of furious quarrel with the representatives of communist literary orthodoxy in Shanghai, where he lived. And I think it's quite revealing to look at sort of how Lu Xun in fact lived through these years when he was supposedly espousing communism. He through this time he spent his time sort of catching Tarzan movies in Shanghai, where he lived in the foreign concession, and he himself didn't actually sort of try to produce proletarian literature. But after his death, within a year or two of his death, Mao Zedong had claimed him as saint of modern China. Xun was a sort of a really wonderful prize for Mao for a couple of reasons. First of all, for his tremendous literary integrity. So sort of through his lifetime, he was sort of acclaimed and sometimes sort of disliked for someone who was willing to criticize almost anything. So he was famed for someone with this sort of restless, polemical impulse. But he was also a man of great literary and sort of artistic prestige. That's a whole bundle of prestige, which was very appealing to someone like Mao. But he was also, of course, a great prize for Mao's revolution, because he was dead and unable to fight back in one of his sort of really. He was an angry man, Lu Xun. I think that's something that comes out very strongly when you read his fiction. Particularly in the 1930s, he was sort of famed, or sort of infamous really, for vicious essayistic attacks that he would sort of release on sort of fellow writers or literary politicos and so on. Mao himself, despite having sort of canonized Lu Xun after his death, he himself admitted that if Lu Xun had sort of lived past 1949 into the People's Republic, that he would either have had to go silent or to have gone to prison.